Well, hi everyone. My name is Carson Whitenauer, and I serve as the Executive Director for Uncommon Pursuit. And today's topic is focused on the next generation. And any healthy organization is always focused on serving the next generation. And in the church, that means we have got to think about how parents and youth ministers can partner together. And so I am thrilled to welcome Pastor Kevin Yee to help us understand and engage these issues today. So, Kevin, welcome to the program. Please tell us a bit about your background and your experience and your passion for this topic.
Yeah, Carson, thanks so much for having me. My name is Kevin Yee, and I'm the youth pastor at Church Every Day. We're a Korean American church in the Los Angeles area, and I've been here for the last 18 years, working with students, families, and parents as a youth pastor for 16 years. And the last couple of years, I've transitioned to working mainly with college and young adults while continuing to oversee the youth ministry. I'm also part of the Rooted Ministry, which is a youth ministry organization dedicated to equipping parents, youth pastors, and youth volunteers to do gospel-centered, Bible-saturated relational discipleships through the local church. We have an incredible website with all sorts of resources for parents and youth workers to be practically equipped and encouraged to do the work of discipling the young church. And you can see all of our stuff at www.rootedministry.com.
Awesome. Okay, that's rootedministry.com. Very easy to find that. And we need to unpack some of those words today, gospel centered, Bible saturated, relational, discipleship through the local church. Those are some pretty meaty phrases. So I think we'll try and unpack some of the heart behind all of that today. My first question for you, Kevin, is that I'm concerned. I think a lot of people are concerned about the state of youth ministry. And that's not to blame youth ministers.
Right.
That's just an observation of how the church as a whole is doing in engaging the next generation. And so I'll just give one stat that I've seen circulating a lot. A Lifeway survey shows that 66% of American young adults who attended church for at least a year as a teenager stopped attending church for some period of time when they were between the ages of 18 and 22. And that's a serious thing if they were in the church and then just because they got older, they stopped going for a significant period of time. And so, Kevin, that breaks my heart. And I want to know you're in this world every day. What is breaking your heart for the next generation?
Yeah, that statistic is very, very sobering for sure, especially as a youth pastor, because that's one of the reasons why I became a youth pastor to begin with. I
Hmm.
actually heard a very similar statistic years and years ago at one of the Passion conferences in Georgia, way back, way back in when I was in college. And actually, the Lord used that statistic specifically to break my heart for the next generation.
Hmm.
And so, when I started youth ministry, that was the statistic that was in the forefront of my mind. And when I started youth ministry, I had this desire to lead the kind of youth group where that would not be true of my students.
Wow.
And so for a lot of the early years, it was constantly talking about that statistic, keeping it in front of us as a youth ministry team, and trying to do everything that we could to help our students to really love being at our church, wanting to be a part of a church and a ministry. And while we generated a lot of excitement and we generated a lot of really, I don't know, great energy is what I'll say. In the end, following up with those students a couple years later, especially when they left to go to college, realized, and I remember specifically, I had a spreadsheet that had all of our students' names on it and sort of where they went
Wow.
to college. And the idea was to follow up with them and see which church they were going to. And realizing that a number of them had basically decided that they were going to pause attending church, that for whatever various reason they couldn't find a church, or just they just felt like it wasn't something they could do at the time or whatever. And then sitting through and working through that list and realizing, oh shoot, like 70% of these students are not attending church right now. And it was devastating for me personally, because that's the thing that I had started youth ministry with. Was this idea that we were gonna beat the statistic essentially, right?
Right.
Only to realize that after all those years, and this was like at like my fifth year into youth ministry, realizing that that first group of students that we really poured into kind of fell to the same numbers that we had seen throughout the American church. It was like, what are we not doing right? And so
Hmm.
there was a lot of soul searching. It was a depressing period. It was a very hard summer to have to face the fact that the last 5 years of ministry that I had been doing previously hadn't really turned things around. And honestly, the biggest lesson that I learned throughout that time was that, as I had shared earlier, I had made the students really love our church, really love our
Hmm.
ministry, really love the style of the way that we were doing things. Truth be told, if I'm perfectly honest, I made them love me, right? We were super fun, we were super relevant, but in the end, the students didn't really know who Jesus was, which
Huh.
sounds totally crazy and totally ironic. Like, how does that happen? But you can put style over substance to the degree where people are attracted to the church and the things that the church does. But in terms of really deeply understanding who their savior is and what their savior has done for them, to the degree where they go off on their own to college and realize they need Jesus to get through college. And so they'll seek out a local church, they'll become a part of the local body
Mhm.
as young adults. That was just something that we hadn't emphasized. It just wasn't
Okay.
something, that was part of the missing piece for us. And also recognizing that as much as we were doing things from a youth ministry perspective, we were really not involving the families all that much. So we were
Huh.
basically the cool Christian hangout place. And people loved going to that place. But when it came time for
Right.
them to leave our church and go off into the various cities and go off into the various universities and colleges, it didn't last because that's all we had become. And that's
Hmm.
not to minimize the kind of ministry that we did. It's not that there wasn't life change. Obviously, for the students that um, still attended church afterwards, like there was some measure of the things that we were doing that were good, but ultimately we needed to mature as a youth ministry. I needed to mature as a youth pastor. And so 5 years in, we had this huge pivot, doing a different kind of ministry, what I like to call sort of whole life discipleship. And that was the shift for us. Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So, just take us through whole life discipleship. What is whole life discipleship? I mean, that's a nice phrase, but what does it mean?
Yeah. So whole life discipleship for us is taking really deep and good theology, doctrine, and marrying that together within a real gospel community where we're fostering honesty and vulnerability. Now, this kind of ministry, it takes time to build because it's not just about we're going to pivot our teaching, we're going to pivot what we talk about or how we talk about it. It really is about a cultural shift that takes place within the
Hmm.
youth ministry. It really is emphasizing relationships over programs. A huge part of the changes that we made were really emphasizing this idea that to know Jesus is to know the Bible, and really connecting
Hmm.
those things together and helping our students really to understand that it's through God's word that you formulate a relationship with Jesus himself. And so really emphasizing that. And then in terms of the ways that we trained our youth volunteers was really saturating them in what the Bible tells us how to do discipleship well, that the way that you disciple an adult is not very different from the way that you would disciple a teenager,
Hmm.
and really raising the bar in that sense, and
Okay.
helping our youth volunteers recognize and realize that yes, they're not quite adults, but the prescriptions that the Bible has for how we disciple students are going to be the same ways in which we disciple adults. And so we talked a lot
Hmm.
about that, and there was a lot more emphasis on small groups and small group relationships, and really taking those relationships as far as we can,
Okay.
in the limited time that we have. Because the other thing about youth ministry is it is limited. You have, if you're doing a high school ministry, you only have 4 years. If you're doing both middle school and high school, then you have maybe 7 to 8 years, depending on how your youth ministry is structured.
Hmm. Okay. So, Kevin, I want to, we've kind of talked about the heartbreak of all of this. And I think it's remarkable that after giving your life to this for 5 years, you actually did the work to track the fruitfulness of it. And when you realized that things hadn't gone as you had hoped for and prayed for and sacrificed for, you were willing to look at that truth honestly with your team and then start to reconfigure things and try a different approach. So I want to ask, you talked about raising the bar. the scriptures call God's people to serve together. And one of my favorite passages is from Ephesians 4, where it says, "But speaking the truth in love, let us grow in every way into Him who is the head, Christ. From Him, the whole body, fitted and knit together by every supporting ligament, promotes the growth of the body for building itself up in love by the proper working of each individual part." So, to put it a different way, you said churches cannot expect to raise up the next generation when they set the bar so low for what high school students can handle. So, as an expert in this, what are we aiming for? What is the desired outcome of a faithful student ministry? Where should we set the bar?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I think faithful student ministry is always seeking to challenge students to grow and chase after Jesus with their entire life. But I think often one of the challenges is that there's pressure on youth workers to keep the students entertained.
Hmm.
Because after all, if the students don't even want to be in the youth group, what good is it to have an amazing, awesome, deep theological lesson, right? And I think this is, it's getting harder and harder and more challenging for youth workers because the worlds that our students occupy are getting harder and harder to compete against, right? The kinds of things that students have access to now compared to students from a decade ago, even just because of the smartphone and all the different entertainment choices. I mean, what do we have to offer that could compete against the kinds of video games, social media, YouTube, TikTok, all these things that can offer just a variety of different kinds of entertainment, and sometimes really actual. There's some really awesome things that you can see on YouTube, such as this video, and
This is one of the
those
best
things are
things you could find
right.
on YouTube.
Exactly. If only our students were watching things like this, right?
Yeah.
So we're really competing for our students' attention. So we have to challenge students to really think beyond their felt needs. Because
Mm.
at any given time, a student's greatest fear is, am I going to be bored? Right. And so we need to, help them to see that that's not the worst possible thing in the world. And to help them actually desire more significance and meaning from their life beyond sort of where they can get, their next hit of dopamine from swiping down and seeing how many likes they have on social media. So I think students need to be activated to serve and think beyond themselves. I think that churches really need to utilize and mobilize students to make an impact in their communities. Again, if you want to reach the next generation, they're all attending schools. And parents and youth workers, we don't have access to the campuses the way our students do, the way our children do. And
Right.
so we want to mobilize them, and we want to really encourage them and train them sort of on how to reach their campuses, how to buck the trend of sort of making the self the ultimate thing, with regards to sort of how they attract meaning in their life, or how they understand meaning in their life. And so I think the other part too is Generation Z in particular. So Generation Z is the generation right now that's basically from like middle school all the way up to sort of your college sophomores or juniors. But that generation, just as a whole, is more concerned with the world's issues than I would
Mhm.
say previous generations before. They're more in tune with things like climate change and things like racial reconciliation and those kinds of things. And so we have a responsibility, I think, as youth workers, as parents, actually, to help our students think through these things in a biblical way. And to not just talk about these issues, but actually mobilize the students to help them see that as people who are part of the church, they can be a light into these places and into these issues. And I think that's what students are looking for. They really are looking
Mhm.
for a church that's doing things that and mobilized to care for things that they care about. So I think that's huge, right?
Yeah, and that really connects with my heart, Kevin. I think I would feel, as an adult, a little insulted if I felt that when I went to church on Sunday, everything was designed just to entertain me. And there was nothing about uh,
Mhm.
conformity to Christ or sacrifice for the kingdom or loving my neighbor. I mean, that's kind of my expectation of going to church. And so, to be in a youth ministry and see your pastor kind of humiliate himself by trying to imitate the latest TikTok fashion, I mean, you might feel pity, that they're
Yeah.
attempting to be like the viral sensation they saw. But it's unlikely that every youth pastor is going to have the same dance moves as, the latest, revolution taking over social media.
Yeah.
And so I think it's just strategic to focus on building a community of transformation that's actively doing something about local issues and engaging with their neighborhood. When I was growing up, the youth group I was in, the mentality I got from that, I don't know how, was I think it was very intentional, was that I needed to prepare in high school so that when I got to college, I would be ready to start a new campus ministry. Because the
Mm.
thinking was, what if there isn't a good church or a good campus ministry wherever I went? And so
Mm.
they wanted to equip me with everything I needed to start my own as if I was going to be, a missionary to an unreached people group.
Yeah.
And
Wow.
so that created a whole new intensity to my high school experience as I
Yeah.
prepared myself to represent Jesus at college. And
Wow.
thankfully, there was a good local church and there was a good local fellowship. But that kind of seriousness really changed my high school experience in a profound way. So,
Yeah. And I think most high school students, they want to be treated seriously in that way.
yeah.
Again, initially when they're walking through the church doors, they may have this outward sense that, oh, they just want to be entertained. But if you really press them, they all are aiming for and desire significance. And when we're able to communicate that through them, that Christ himself can give you that kind of meaning and significance, they'll be all over that for sure.
Mhm.
Yeah.
So, this is all nice. It would be great if this is how it worked, but it seems to me that youth ministers and parents kind of are set up for conflict.
Mm.
And here's one way I see that happening is that youth ministers feel they're called by God to disciple the next generation to follow Jesus and address the issues you've talked about. So they've got a very specific vision. Maybe they've gone to seminary for this. Maybe they have years or decades of experience in knowing what works, what doesn't work. They've got a biblical, theological model for how they're engaging in the work. This is their full time thing. Okay. And then parents, their children come into the youth ministry and they're thinking, I've got my own agenda for my kids. Like they're developing into their own people, but I have a certain expectation for what my kids are learning wherever they go. And they don't want to give that away to a youth minister or a teacher or a coach necessarily. I think parents right now are very protective of their kids, and they feel in the church that that's something God has entrusted to them. And so there's kind of like a, who's in charge or who's in control or who has more influence. There's an ego battle maybe set up between parents and the youth minister. And so, Kevin, why is it in your experience that youth ministers and parents aren't able to work together to serve the next generation?
Yeah, I think what you mentioned with regards to um, that tension of who's really supposed to be stewarding my child's faith.
Hmm.
I think that there's a lack of clarity in that sometimes.
Hmm.
And so there's churches that actually don't believe in youth ministry because they're so strongly believe that
Oh,
it is the parents' responsibility. And so there's no youth ministry at all, and it's all on the parents. And so in that sense, I think it's important to recognize that the reason why churches initially set up youth ministries was so that there could be places for students to work alongside and grow alongside their peers. Because there's something beautiful about that, about young people getting together, worshiping Jesus together, serving alongside the broader church together. But sometimes I think so. This is especially true of the Asian American church. But sometimes I
mm,
think one of the other tensions that exist is so in a lot of Asian cultures, or actually the global South as well, I've talked to Hispanic youth pastors, and they run into sort of the same kind of tension here, where it's basically we're considered the experts, right? So the youth pastor, or like a teacher or a tutor. Or something like this. So we're considered the experts, and the idea is, I'm going to give my child to you, and then you're supposed to download all of your knowledge onto them, and then it's not so much that they're hands on. It's actually the opposite. They're very, very hands
mm,
off. And it's, you're the youth pastor, you're the youth expert, here you go. And so there's not a lot of partnership that happens because the assumption is that it's the youth pastor's job to do everything. And so, I drop my kid off at youth group. It's your job to save them, and I'm going to pick them up, and 4 years later they're going to be like the best Christian, and it's going to be fine. So I
Right.
think there's that as well, which is kind of the opposite issue of what you're talking about. But I think a lot of that
Mhm.
kind of comes down to this idea of expectations and what's communicated and what's not communicated about what the church's vision for the youth ministry is. So I think on one hand, I think churches need to do a better job as a whole of sort of communicating that the youth ministry doesn't exist to be the sole place where students can learn and grow and be discipled, but that it is really a place where parents can be supported in the discipleship that they should already be doing with their students. So
Hmm.
I think that's a better vision. I think that's a better way to communicate what the youth ministry is. And I think when you talk about youth ministry as a place where parents can be supported in the discipleship that they're already doing, it sets up a different kind of expectation. It sets up an expectation where the youth ministers and the youth volunteers understand that it's their job to support parents, but it also helps parents to understand that these people are here to support us in discipleship, in helping our students to know and love Jesus more. And so rather than seeing each other on different sides of the coin, we begin to see each other as resources, really. And the truth is, especially in the teenagers, and any parent of a teenager will tell you that when students go into middle school and high school and they start to be a little more independent, it's really nice to have a young adult, somebody who's a little bit younger than the parent, part of a different generation, to come alongside the parents to help advocate for the things that we all want together for our students and our children. And so in that sense, I think kind of creating that sense and that expectation, I think, is really key for how we learn how to partner better together. And again,
Hmm.
these are not things that can be programmed. I think there's probably some shortcuts you can take initially to get the ball rolling, but these are cultural things. And so if
Hmm.
your church has a long history of a youth ministry that maybe is like super successful, but the parents aren't as involved, it's going to take a lot to kind of turn that ship around. But I
Hmm.
do think that it's worth talking about how we do that and how we begin to develop that culture where we can start to see one another as resources and not really just as sort of feeder ministries or feeder places. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And I'm glad you brought up the cultural differences because I think each of us, as we're listening to this, has to take what you're sharing and think through, okay, how does this work out, in my cultural context? And just thinking about myself right now, I mean, there is a sense in which, we take our kids to soccer and I'm expecting the coach to teach them everything they need to know about soccer. I'm not doing a lot of reinforcement at home. Maybe I will start to do that as my kids get older. I take them to chess club and I'm expecting they're going to learn things about chess that I don't know.
Right.
And so that mentality, I can see it very easily bleeding over to church and saying, well, I'll just drop them off at the youth ministry.
Mm-hmm.
And just like, they're learning math at school and soccer in this program, they'll learn Jesus here. And I can expect them to take care of that. And what you're saying is very different. And maybe that's another topic for another day is how do we equip parents to disciple their own kids? Because I'm not sure that parents have necessarily gone to classes and gotten the training they need to be disciplers of their own children. And so that may be a gap as well, where if you don't feel equipped for it, you're like, I hope the youth minister's got that one,
Yeah.
because with
Yeah.
my job and the things we got to take care of our parents and all these other responsibilities that parents have, they may be thinking I can't disciple my own kids, and they're neglecting a fundamental responsibility in that way.
Right. Which is why I
So,
think it's so important for youth ministries to consider this idea of whole life discipleship.
hmm,
Because I think one of the things that happens is when you are really thinking through what it looks like to teach theology and doctrine, but also really learn how to practice that in community, you actually can't do that without that kind of parent partnership. And because
right,
it requires more time for everyone to be spending together. And then on top of that, the things that the students are really immersed in are really broader cultural issues as well. So like when our students have questions about their sexuality, gender, race, ethnicity, all of those things, do parents really want their youth pastor to be talking about those things without having an understanding of what it is they're going to actually be talking about? So there needs to be partnership on that end, a lot of communication on that end too, because youth pastors don't want to be talking about things and teaching things that the parents don't necessarily agree with. And if there is disagreement, right, we need to have spaces where we can
If
discuss those things and reach, be on the same page, so to speak, because these are important things, and we can't just relegate that to some corner of youth ministry, right? What we believe about, our bodies and our sexuality and all that stuff, that's everything, right? And so I think it's important that we have a recognition of what our roles are supposed to be. Yeah.
Hmm. That's going to take a lot of work for some churches to even have the courage to address those issues and then to address them across, every generation of that church.
Mhm.
So we've talked about a lot of the pain points so far. I want to hear some of your best ideas. What are the ways that parents and youth ministers partner together, and it's glorious. It's beautiful. It's just everyone is growing in Jesus. What does that look like?
I think, yeah. So I would say starting with, I think the easiest place that you can start to really change the culture is actually by praying together, finding spaces, intentional spaces for parents, youth workers, and youth volunteers to get together to pray together for the students. I think having some sort of regular space where that can happen, um, mainly because in praying together, there's a lot of vulnerability. You can
Mm,
bring things that might not come up in regular conversation, but you can bring those things up as prayer requests before the Lord. And I
yeah.
think what happens is youth workers will learn about the fears that parents have, the things that they're concerned about as they hear about the things that the parents want to pray for. And then conversely, the parents can hear about the things that the youth workers and youth volunteers are seeing in youth ministry, are seeing in the students themselves, that maybe the parents don't see at home. It's not uncommon for teenagers, not to really tell their parents everything that's going on in their life.
That
And
happens.
so yeah, exactly, right? Shocker. But I think when we're able to hear the things that we really need the Lord for, it creates vulnerability. And afterwards, there's conversation that happens, like, hey, you prayed for this. I think my child might be going through this. Is there is what can I do better, or how can we pray for each other?
Mm,
That sort of thing. So I think that's probably like one programmatic thing that I think really can begin to shape the culture. Now, granted, it's never going to be popular. Like you're not going to have 100% attendance for a prayer meeting, but it does plant seeds for growth later on for sure, as this kind of thing is a regular part of what it looks like to be a part of the youth ministry together. And
mm,
then I think giving parents and youth workers and opportunities and time to spend getting to know one another. This
right.
could be programized as well. This could be a program, but I really do think that this is more for parents to invite the youth pastors into their lives.
Mm,
Taking the youth pastor out to coffee, getting to know them. I think having good parent and youth pastor relationships is how you foster that partnership for sure. Um, and I do think that this is probably something that parents are going to need to do. That I think the onus is going to be more on parents to reach
mm,
out to the youth worker and youth volunteers to get to know them. Again, take them out for coffee, grab a meal, or something like that. And then, really, if there's a church that this is just not a part of the culture at all, everyone is kind of siloed, then I think the broader church leadership needs to work together to find ways for that sort of thing to happen.
yeah.
And in churches like that, I'm sure because the culture is set in a certain way, it's going to be like, why would we even want this? It just sounds like another thing that we're adding on the plate of everybody. But really, I think seeking to make that as relational as possible is going to be huge. But all of it takes just lots and lots of communication. I think if a
Mm,
youth pastor really does want to get to know parents, but that kind of culture doesn't really exist in the church, youth pastor can start with just a lot of communication, over communication, like doing things like emailing the parents, newsletters, resources, articles, like just kind of communicating all the time. Hey, I really want to get to know you. I hope this article helps you. I hope these resources are good for you. And just kind of putting it out there And then eventually parents will get it. "Oh, okay, this guy really wants to help us, or this woman really wants to come alongside our family." And I think that's one of the ways that youth workers can work on that from their end, is just over communicating and being
Hmm.
really expressive about the things that they hope helps the parents with resources and things. Yeah.
Hmm. Yeah, well, I mean, I think if you're praying together, if you're sharing your hearts over coffee, if there's a pattern of ongoing communication, here are the topics we're covering, here's a resource to help you at home, and if parents will also step into that with initiative and not as another thing they've got to do, but as an opportunity to serve the Lord together in the local church and encourage the youth minister and be on the same page about discipling the next generation, just the model that sets for children to see that, wow, mom and my Bible study leader know each other and like each other and support each other. Just the integrity of that relationship says a lot to your daughter or your son about the kinds of people Christians are, that
Mhm.
we're not just a spiritual mall, but we're a family that's knit together in Jesus and is on his mission together. If we want that to be the experience our kids have, it has to be something we model. Um, Now, Kevin, you keep talking about whole life discipleship versus programs, and I'll just be the naive person in the room. What's the difference between whole life discipleship and a program? How do I know if I'm just running programs or actually doing whole life discipleship?
I think the best way to think about that is not to look at what it is that you're doing necessarily, but I think it's more thinking about what happens afterwards. What's the
Hmm.
conversation that happens after the youth group event is done? And what I mean by that is thinking about metrics, right? So if your conversation after the youth event is done is how many people came, how many decisions were there, um, how many schools were represented, that sort of thing. I think the mindset is more programmatic, but I
Okay.
think the conversation after an event is really about follow up.
Hmm.
Who did you talk to? What did we learn from them? How can we better care for them? What are the things that we need to do next week to follow up with the conversations that we had? I think that shows that the ways that you're thinking about, the ways that you're bringing students together for the youth group is really about whole life discipleship. I would say that would be the
Okay.
difference. Is it's more of an attitude, because I think a youth ministry that's doing whole life discipleship doesn't mean you're not going bowling. Like, you're still going bowling, but you're not thinking about the numbers afterwards. You're really thinking about, man, there was a moment where they had mentioned something and then they had to go bowl, and so I couldn't follow up. But these are the things that we need to be praying for. These are the things that we need to be thinking about. I'm going to text them afterwards and say, hey, you're about to share with me something, but you got distracted or whatever. Could we, follow up with that? Could you share with me a little bit more about what you were going to be talking
Hmm.
about? And I think if that becomes the attitude of what's going on post youth group meeting among the volunteers and the youth workers, I think that shows that there's been a sort of change in the ways that we're approaching youth ministry. So I
Okay.
think that's going to be sort of the biggest indicator for how we think about what's changed in our youth group, and whether or not we're really aiming to do relational ministry, or we're really just trying to maintain this ministry as a place where teenagers want to be. So I think that's going to be
Okay.
the main difference. Yeah.
Are we just hosting successful event after successful event, or are we available to people, and are their hearts trusting us? And in that relationship, are we seeing transformation into Christ likeness? That's a that's a very massive difference. You could have the same
Right.
numbers in the
Uh
room
huh.
and a completely different culture of, we're putting on a successful event with the light show, or yeah, there's lights, but what's really
Right.
interesting is what God's doing in the people we love and care about and are praying for.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So, Kevin, you shared earlier that parents need to understand that youth workers are people too, and sometimes that we see people in their function. My kid's
Mm-hmm.
teacher, I don't know about her marriage or anything. Just like, is my kid learning math? That's what I'm
Yeah.
most interested in. And sometimes that attitude could bleed over to someone in youth ministry is, I don't know anything about you, but you know, my kid's misbehaving at home. Are you going to solve that problem for me?
Mm-hmm.
And I can imagine that youth ministers notice that attitude and have found a way to respond to it, but it can get wearisome to just, what can you do for me and my family? And so I want to flip the script for a second and ask, if we could just dream in an ideal world, in a perfect church, what would be some of the ways that the church community could really show that they love their youth ministers as image bearers of God, that they really care about them, and just show the youth ministers, we love you? What would that feel and look like for you?
That'd be amazing. That'd be incredible. No, I think one of the so most youth pastors, most youth ministers tend to be young when they start, and so they have a lot of energy, a lot of ideas. But usually, what they need, and what I would love for churches to be able to provide for youth pastors and youth workers, is just a lot of mentorship, older people
Hmm.
coming alongside to really care for them as people, not so much concerned about, how are you doing as a youth pastor or youth worker, but really, how are you doing, full stop,
Right.
and really getting into their life and providing accountability. One of the
Hmm.
things I've noticed, especially in the Asian American context, is there's a lot of youth workers and youth pastors who are in their 20s or early 30s, and there aren't a lot of other 20s and 30s at the church. And so they find a lot of their community outside of the church, which I think is good because we all need peer community. But at the same time, I think when there's too much of a gap in terms of the kinds of communities that youth workers and youth ministers are seeking out for themselves versus what the church community is really supposed to be, I think in the long run that can be pretty damaging for everybody
Yes.
involved. And so I think for some of the older men and women in the church to really take the youth pastors and youth ministers under their wing, sort of in a very personal way, um, and discipling them. And again, somebody in their 50s and 60s is not going to know what's best for the next generation, but they will know how to care for somebody who's in their 20s and 30s. And I
Right.
think developing and having those kinds of relationships and even that kind of discipleship really is what I would call it. I think that can be such a life giving thing for really the church as a whole, for everybody that's involved in that endeavor.
Hmm. Well, there might be one person who's watching this, and they just need to go and send an email to their youth minister and invite them
Mm.
out to a nicer place for lunch, and let them know, I'm picking up the tab.
Right.
Make sure the youth minister orders an appetizer, gets whatever they want from the entrees, has a dessert,
Yeah.
and knows there's no risk they're going to pay for it at the end, and just take
Right.
the time to ask some questions and be available, and then say, hey, could we do this again next month? I've really enjoyed my
Yeah.
time with you.
Yeah.
And,
Yeah.
if just two or three people in the community in that church said, hey, that's the way I'm going to treat our youth minister, no strings attached. I'm just going to be available to them and make sure they get well fed once a month. I mean, that could be a tremendous resource for someone who's right out of college and is just giving of themselves to reach the next generation.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Hmm.
So, one question we got, Kevin, from a participant in this event is they wanted to know, what are some strategies you have found that are most helpful for youth to develop a sense of belonging in a church community?
Yeah. So I took this question to mean so in the church community in a broader sense. And
Okay.
so I think in the broader sense, I think church leadership should invite youth students to serve in the body. So wherever
Yes.
it's possible and appropriate for students to work alongside adults. In churches where the youth students are a part of the main sort of congregation, to allow them to do things like ushering occasionally, not maybe every week, but and again, pairing them up with another adult who's going to show them like, oh, this is this family, and I always greet them a certain way, and really just kind of learning the ins and outs of the church community. That's a
Hmm.
huge way to communicate that teenagers belong in the church, because I do
Yeah.
think that one of the issues that a lot of youth ministries have is when teenagers are always isolated in the youth room or in the youth space. Really, when they grow up and it's time for them to graduate high school, because their version of the church was always just the youth space, they're not going to want to attend the broader church when they graduate youth group because they were never a part of the broader church's youth group, right? They were always
It's a
just
huge
in.
like cultural shift, and yeah.
Exactly, exactly. So because to them, youth group is the church. And so when youth group is not accessible anymore, because you're the creepy 20-year-old is no longer allowed to be worshiping alongside the 14-year-old, neither is the church really. And that's why I think a lot of students go so far as to not attend church anymore as a whole. It's just
Mm,
totally an unrecognizable thing. And so I think that there needs to be definitely spaces where adults and students can be working alongside one another for the broader community. And then definitely with service projects, if the church is actively engaged in the community in different ways, inviting students to be a part of those things. Any kind of mercy ministry, there's some sort of adjustment that can be made so that students could occasionally join whatever it is that the adults are doing. Unless it's a high risk
yeah.
thing, students can definitely be a part of those things. And when they're invited to be a part of that, especially again in their local community, I think that's pretty huge. And that's a way for the broader church to constantly be communicating to the youth students, you belong here. Like this is your
Mhm.
church. And I think that's huge to be able to communicate that. Yeah.
Well, and the ideas you suggested say more than kind of an insecure desperation of I hope the youth like us and hope we're cool for them.
Mm,
It's saying not only do you belong here, but we need you. Um, a lot of high school students might be very accomplished and could be in the Sunday worship band if that's something your
mhm,
church has, or if you have a choir, they could sing in the choir and go to
right.
choir practice, get to know adults there, or they could read the Bible before the sermon, or
Mhm,
pass the plate if your church passes a plate. Maybe that you don't, but I mean, there's a lot of different. In my church, I've seen middle school students be helpers in the elementary school environments, and I've seen
right.
high school students help out in the middle school environments. Be small group
Mhm,
assistants and that kind of thing. And so there's a way it seems of not just we hope you like it, but we need your help, and
yeah.
everyone in God's body here has a role to play.
And
Um,
teenagers, believe they know everything. So this is like
so
good
yeah,
opportunity to take
test that
advantage
out.
of that youthful exuberance and confidence.
Right.
For sure.
Okay. Here's another question that we just got. What is a good ratio of youth ministers to students if you're going to do a relational whole life discipleship approach? And
Right.
what are ways parents can volunteer to come alongside youth ministers in helping with small groups? So that's something we just got. What do you say to that, Kevin?
Yeah. I think probably a really great, like the ideal ratio is 1 to 5, 1 to 6, kind of like we can put them all in a car and we can go somewhere type of
Okay.
thing. Jesus might say 1 to 12. um, but I think yeah, 1 to 5 or 6 is probably like that's the number where you can really get into each other's lives. But the group is large enough that if there's 1 or 2 students who are more on the quiet side or on the shyer side, it doesn't completely tank the group's enthusiasm as a whole. So I would say, but I know that in so many churches that ratio is really hard. Like even in our church right now, especially with the ways that COVID has made a mess out of how churches volunteer, recruit, and things like that. Right now, our ratio is about probably closer to 1 out of 15, 1 to every 15, and week to week, depending on how many people have been exposed to different things, like just that has not really worked out, and so it's really tough right now for sure. Um, but then I think other ways that parents can come alongside. So for us, in our church specifically, food is everything, right? People aren't gathering unless there's some sort of food provided, and so our parents are so good about cooking for us, being around us. Those have turned into ministries on their own, where parents will come. Usually, moms will come and they'll cook for us, and they will have their own prayer meeting, their own sort of little support systems, where they can talk about what's going on in their family life and with the things that they're struggling with. And so those are things that have kind of spun off of the fact that because the youth ministry is gathering, because there needs to be food, because there needs to be these things and that stuff, parents will come alongside us. They'll volunteer for those things, but at the same time, they'll also use that as ways for them to help and support one another as well. So that's one of the ways that
Mm,
we do it at our church. But in terms of volunteering for small groups, I mean, I would say about 70% of our volunteers at our church in the youth ministry are actually parents of students. And that in the beginning was a little weird for some of the students that were in the ministry to know that their mom or dad was one of the small group leaders. But you know, once we had enough leaders where that became normal, it was not a problem anymore. And I
Hmm.
would say, actually, for the students that had their parents in youth ministry serving as small group teachers and small group volunteers, they are the ones that loved it the most, if I'm perfectly honest. You know,
Wow.
that first year where their parents were volunteering and they were in middle school, it was like, oh, why is my mom or dad here? But honestly, once they got over that, it was, yeah, it's some of the best kinds of relationships that we see at the church, to be perfectly
Hmm.
honest. Yeah.
Well, I mean, Kevin, I have had the pleasure of being at your church, and the amount of food that the volunteers of your church provided, uh, I felt like I had never eaten in my life before. I felt like
Oh,
I had
good.
only had like, little breadcrumbs at church before, and I had finally understood what the kingdom of heaven looked like. So
Oh, that's awesome.
the standard of your church was uh, unimaginable to me before I had been. So, yeah, the amount of love and care that parents are pouring into the next generation just through calories. You have a very high like calorie to student ratio at your church,
that, that
and
is
it
very
is
true.
glorious. It is so
Yeah.
glorious. Yeah. So, um, well, Kevin, that comment about getting small groups together and having
Mhm.
an adult leader with, people who are, maybe as young as 14 or even younger,
Mm,
brings me to the final question I have in mind. And that's a comment we received in preparing for this event.
yeah.
One person said that parents must be on the lookout for youth ministers getting romantically or sexually involved with their children. And we have seen the stories ricocheting around social media and traditional media, um, of abuse that's taken place in that. And I think we have to extend that to include a culture of watching out for parents who might want to come be a small group leader in the youth ministry, looking for someone vulnerable, or just an older adult in the church who says, "Hey, I'll go volunteer with the middle school, or I'll help out in the high school."
Right.
And the sad thing is they don't come in with creepy voices and weird clothes and bad bo. Usually these people are very intentional about their personal appearance and making sure they have a good reputation, and sort of grooming the other adults to think of them as someone who's
Yeah.
super safe, super safe. You can really trust me. And they want to groom the adults so that they have easier access to someone who's vulnerable. So tell us, how do you put in protections to, have a culture of safety for the children or the students?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I think we have to absolutely do our due diligence when it comes to making sure our students are safe with our youth leaders. I think honestly, you have to create a culture where any suspicious or odd behavior there needs to be a safe place for people to be able to talk about that. So
Yeah.
if there's a student that feels uncomfortable with youth worker and they bring it up to you as a youth minister, like we have to take those things very very seriously, and we need to make sure that we don't minimize the experiences that our youth workers or that our youth students are having with a volunteer. Because again, we are not going to be able to see every single interaction that takes place between a student and an adult. And so I think that absolutely needs to be the kind of culture that exists. I think that the same goes for the adults. That if there's any adult that feels uncomfortable about another adult because the way they're with the student, and the student could be totally oblivious, but it's an adult that feels uncomfortable with the way another adult is behaving, we have to have and make sure that we are receptive to those concerns and those comments, that we are doing our due diligence to investigate and making sure that we are able to have those kinds of hard conversations with
Yeah.
the people that people are uncomfortable with, to be able to sit down with them and to explain to them, that it's important that they don't cross any boundaries. These are the things that we're seeing, and even asking adult volunteers to step down. That's going to be appropriate when it's hard. It's hard enough getting any volunteers possible, and so the idea of having to tell a volunteer that they need to step down, especially
Yeah.
because if we're perfectly honest, if somebody really has that kind of wicked evil intent and is really grooming, and has that kind of grooming behavior, they're probably very incredibly popular
Yeah.
among students and among the adult leaders. And so to ask them to step down and tell them to take a break, I mean, that's gonna infuse a lot of drama into the youth ministry, and especially because you can't just go right up on stage afterwards and say, "Well, we asked that person to step down because they're being super creepy." Like, we can't do that either. So it's always gonna put us as the youth leaders in a really rough spot, I think for sure. But we have to recognize that we have to prioritize this because there's nothing worse than a youth ministry environment that's not safe. You could do everything that you want to, but in the end, if somebody gets hurt or abused, God forbid, that 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 kind of trauma and that kind of scarring is going to last for a lifetime. And so we have to be really, really diligent. We have to really be on top of this, and part of that means being very part of that means not being naive to the idea that this could never happen under my watch or in my youth group, that this could happen in
Right.
other places, but it can't happen with us. So I think one of the other things that we have to do is we have to communicate really good boundaries looks like with our volunteer staff, because it can't just be me that holds everybody accountable. We really need to create a culture where everybody is accountable to one another, and so we have to be really clear. This is what good boundaries look like, and the clearer we are, the easier it is, actually, because we're helping people spot what inappropriate behavior looks like by clearly
Mhm.
communicating what the boundaries are. And so again, sometimes youth ministers aren't necessarily equipped to know what that should look like. So I think getting outside consultants can be really helpful. This is where I think church
Yes.
leadership as a whole needs to really guide the youth minister in this regard. There's no such thing as 100% guarantee of safety, but we have to do our best to provide for our students in this area. I think I told you that earlier in one of my notes. Shepherd's primary job is to keep the sheep safe. And so if this is an area that we're unwilling to do the due diligence in and unwilling to put the work in, we really need to question whether or not we should be working with youth students in particular. So I think that's
Yeah.
a very sobering reminder that we are working with a very vulnerable age, and so we need to be doing our due diligence to make sure that the environment is safe for everyone involved.
Yeah. Kevin, I mean, I just totally agree with what you just shared and the heart with which you shared it. And you're right. If we aren't willing to put in the work to build a culture where our whole church is safe for the vulnerable, we've really got some messed up priorities.
Mm,
And the damage that does to the abused person and to people who know them and to those who hear about the story, that is going to undo so much of the good work that church has done. Not that you can balance them out, it's just the church has got to show that we are not a safe place for someone who's a predator, but we are a safe place for the vulnerable. And here's how we have trained ourselves and built a culture that is
right.
safe. And if anyone's watching and they're still like kind of in that pride spot that you shared about it, kind of a naive spot of it won't happen here, we have good people here, they really love the Lord, it's not the kind of thing we have to worry about. I just want to share some statistics I picked up on this. According to Ministry Safe, 1 in 4 women and 1 in 6 young men are abused before the age of 18, and 66% of these survivors don't disclose until adulthood if they ever share that traumatic story with anyone. And if the numbers are that high, it's taking place in churches too. And so we've got to wake up to this and put in place trainings and communication strategies to make the church far safer than schools and athletic spots and other places. The Ministry Safe program also taught me that abusers gravitate towards programs where the barriers to entry are lowest, and that 90% of children are abused by someone they know and trust. So, to Kevin's point, if you're desperate for volunteers and you're like, we just, any warm bodies will do, we just really need you. There's no training, and just anyone who comes will take you. You're saying we're vulnerable to abusers because you're desperate. And so, having a way to say, even if you've got 0 volunteers, the first one is going to get screened because the stakes are too high to have that vulnerability. Um, Another thing they taught me in the Ministry Safe program is that 1 out of 3 abuse cases are peer-to-peer cases. And so we also have to watch out for, a high school senior and a high school freshman and those kinds of incidences, and teach the students, hey, here's kind of the expectations for how peer-to-peer relationships happen. Here's the boundaries for you guys too. And so I think we have to understand how grooming works, that we're trained to identify signs of it, and that we create a see something, say something culture in our churches.
Yes.
And one final point on this is that if, despite your very best efforts, abuse still takes place, one of your very first phone calls has got to be to law enforcement and to get the authorities involved to take this to its appropriate conclusion. And you might be afraid of the bad press or whatever, but you have got to do the right thing and call law enforcement. So this is not a workshop on how to prevent abuse in youth ministries or in the church. We're not going to pretend that we're experts on this, but I'm glad that the question was asked and we could say, hey, this is a priority. Make sure you get the full training on it from experts. And this is part of the culture of how parents and youth ministers work together for the next generation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Kevin, we have covered a lot of different focus points on how parents and youth pastors work together. As we close out here, any final thoughts or encouragements that you'd like to offer?
Yeah, I think to any youth minister who's watching this, youth ministry can sometimes be a lonely place,
Mhm.
especially if you're in 20s and 30s. There aren't a lot of younger people at the church. And, sometimes it can almost feel like your bestest friends are youth students. That's not a great place to be. And I know
No.
how difficult it can be sometimes to feel that way. And I just want to encourage you to really talk to your church leadership about what it looks like to start a mentorship program for yourself. Just be
Mm.
vulnerable and honest about what you need. And then I would say that's one way for you to open yourself up to the broader church. And when you are vulnerable about your needs, you're engaging in sort of changing the culture of the church, where everybody's not alone on their own doing their own thing, but they really are
Yeah.
supported by everybody in general. And then I would say to any parents that are watching this that really would hope for better relationships with their youth ministers and youth workers, to see the youth worker as a person first, not so much as somebody who's going to be doing good things with your students, but to really think about them as a person. So what do they need? What are some ways that you as a family, or maybe groups of families, could maybe meet some of the needs that the youth pastor has? And again, as Carson shared earlier, it could just be simple, like a family meal together. Just maybe that's something that they need or desire, or just maybe they need a break. And if there's a way for maybe parents to get together and just give the youth worker a break for one weekend or one youth group meeting or something like that. I think those are the ways in which, when parents really show that they care for the person that the youth pastor is, that can create so many wonderful dynamics for setting up a really good partnership between parents and youth workers.
Thank you, Kevin. You have shared so much wisdom with us today. Anyone who has watched today's program can find you on Twitter at Kevin H. Yee. And you can also go to rootedministry.com. And I just want to read their mission statement because it's very similar to what today's program is about. It's to equip and empower churches and parents to faithfully disciple students toward lifelong faith in Jesus Christ. And that's exactly what we've been talking about today. So check out their website and consider some of their resources in your church's journey. And I think you'll find a very close connection between their work and what we've talked about today. So I'll put those links in the description of the video on YouTube. I also want to mention that the Uncommon Pursuit community is another space to discuss these questions with brothers and sisters in Christ from around the world. And you can learn more about this ministry at uncommonpursuit.net. And if you want to invest in helping others have a strong and confident faith, I hope you'll join the community today. You can join completely for free. And it's an encouraging place to start important conversations, serve others who have difficult questions, and grow in your own walk with the Lord. I can promise that you will get more benefit out of participating in Uncommon Pursuit than mindlessly scrolling your favorite social media app. So make the switch today. Kevin, again, thank you for your time and the insights that you have shared with us today.
Thank you so much,
Um,
Carson, for having me. It's a joy.
yeah. Well, so everyone who's watching, thank you so much. Your time is invaluable and you shared it with us. I hope to see you at a future event or in our community.